Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today we're looking at the topping D90SE DAC. Before we get to the review though, I do want to quickly mention the fact that the giveaway of the Palm Quiet Minis is currently going on. It's a really easy giveaway to enter. All you need to do is be a subscriber and leave a comment down below about something you'd like to know more about in the audiophile hobby. It could be something you're confused about, something you just want to know more depth on, whatever it is. All you need to do is be a subscriber and leave a comment that's relevant to that question. I'll be drawing the giveaway using random number generator in a few weeks' time, so it is a luck of the draw giveaway. So make sure you've subscribed, commented, and stay tuned. I reviewed the original topping D90 some time ago now on the channel. It's a DAC that I quite liked and I kept in my collection for quite some time. With the fire in the AKM factory that I think was in late 2020 if I remember correctly, it made stock of the AKM AK449 chip that was used in the original D90. It made those very hard to come by. So Topping's response to the shortage of chips and ultimately the end of supply of those chips was to move over to a Sabre-based version of the same device. In a second I'll talk about what's different and upgraded in the SE version, but for now let's start with a closer look at the topping D90SE. The D90SE retails for $899 US or roughly 1,200 Australian dollars. That puts it right at the upper end of any of the sort of mid-range price DACs. So it still maintains that sub $1,000 price tag, but it's certainly not a cheap investment. And therefore, you should have high expectations of what this DAC can provide. And the good news, without giving too much away, is I do think it's worth the money, but there's also a few things that are worth knowing about the D90. First of all, let's cover off what's the same and what's different between the original D90 and the D90SE. First of all, what's the same is all of the features and functions in terms of what it can do are identical. And what I mean by that, it's got the same inputs, it's got the same outputs, it's fully balanced, it's got Bluetooth. I think that's basically all I can think of. So within the general basics of inputs, outputs, preamp functionality, all of that is identical. Where the SE version gets a bit of an upgrade, or in one case a potential sidestep, is in terms of some of the extra bits and pieces going on inside that just facilitate what the DAC does. What I mean by that is things like the XMOS card that drives the USB interface, that's been upgraded. Obviously the sidestep I was talking about is the chip, where we've moved from an AKM 4499 to a Sabre ES9038 Pro. What comes with that, which is one of the key differences between the original and the D90SE, is that the SE comes with MQA as standard. With the original D90, you had to choose if you wanted the non-MQA version or the MQA version. That no longer exists. It's the D90SE and it always has MQA. I'm not going to talk at length about MQA. It's been covered to death in lots of different places. All I'm going to say is it's there if you want it. You don't have to use it if you don't want it. One final thing that the D90SE can do that the D90 couldn't do, and it comes because of that XMOS chip, is it allows it to handle super high-res audio. What I mean by that is it'll do DST 1024 and it'll also do PCM up to 768 kHz. If that means nothing to you, don't worry too much about it. It's not one of those things that I think is particularly important. Some people may use those sorts of features, A, if you've got a DST library of music, or B, if you're using some kind of upsampling, like using HQ Player for instance. Beyond that, it's not a feature that I think has a huge amount of demand, but it's great that it's there if you want it. While we're talking features and functions, let's cover off just a couple more things before we talk sound quality. The D90SE here has 7 filters available to you. They do make subtle changes to the sound, But at the same time, as I've said over and over again in other reviews, so apologies for repeating myself if you've seen those reviews, it doesn't change the character of the DAC. What those filters will do is make slight differences to the sense of space and the sense of attack on the edges of notes. I like the fact that the filters are made available, but at the same time, most people are going to find one, choose it, and stick to it. As a reminder as well, if you're not familiar with the original D90, the D90 and now the D90 SE are also preamp capable. What I mean by that is you can set it into DAC mode, or you can set it into preamp mode. In preamp mode, that's going to allow you to change the volume of the device and therefore drive active speakers with it if you wish, or if you've got a particularly high gain amplifier like something like the MT601, 2 or 4 that I reviewed recently. With those sorts of high gain amps, you might want to tame the output from the DAC, and you can do that with the D90 SE. The D90 did that as well, but it's still nice that feature's there. In case you're wondering how to change that setting, what you need to do is switch off the unit at the front, switch off the unit at the back, and then hold down the front power button as you flick on the rear power switch. That's going to take you into a different configuration menu on the screen here, and then you can use the up and down arrows to move through the menu and the button over here to select the options. I'm not normally a huge fan of having menus buried in complex systems like that, but on this occasion it's totally fine because it's not something you're going to use regularly. Almost all other functionality is available through the use of the remote control. Speaking of the remote control though, I do wish there was a bit more functionality using the buttons on the front of the device. Your ability to control the device is very, very limited if you don't want to use the remote. All you can really do on the front of the device is turn the power on and change the volume. You can also cycle through the inputs with that button, and that's about it. So just to provide a quick tour of the front panel, and I didn't do this straight away because there's not much on it, you've got a power button and a selector button for the sources, and you've got up and down arrow keys for changing the volume. That's all there is to the front panel. Everything else is going to be done from the remote control. So on the remote control, you can change the brightness, you can set the auto on-off function, which will switch the device on and off based on the USB status. You can change the filters from the remote control. And so as I said before, basically everything you're going to need regularly is on that remote. The one thing that you might want to use more often that isn't on the remote control is the ability to change from DAC to preamp mode. But I don't think it's something you're going to be doing really regularly, so I don't think that's a big deal. Also, in my testing, I didn't find any significant difference between the DAC output and the preamp output, assuming the preamp output is maxed to full volume. To me, given that there's a bit of time delay in switching over, there wasn't a big enough difference to warrant having this in DAC mode if you sometimes want to use the volume. So I would probably myself leave this in preamp mode, cycle through the volume when you need to, but max it out when you want this to behave like a DAC. While we're touring the unit, let's have a look at the back. On the back, things are pretty straightforward. We've got XLR outputs, we've got RCA outputs. Again, remember they're variable or fixed depending on the settings. We've then got a whole bunch of digital inputs. And the topping D90 SE, as it was with the D90 regular, these are very well featured in terms of inputs. Not only do you have USB, optical, coaxial, but you've also got I2S and AES if you want to use them. I had some problems getting set up with the I2S, so I can't speak in detail about the sound quality of that. However, I do intend to have another attempt when I've got a bit more time, so you might hear more in my future review of the SMSL SD9. That's a network player device that does have I2S, so my intention is to get it set up with the topping D90 SE and test it that way. So stay tuned for the SD9 review if you want to know more about I2S and whether it's the same, better or worse than using the regular traditional digital inputs. Stay tuned for that one and make sure you're subscribed. For now though, moving along with the back, we've got a space for an antenna here, so under that red cap is the screw thread for the Bluetooth antenna. So this does have Bluetooth 5.0 and LDAC capability. And then finally, over on the side, we've got our regular IEC main socket. So once again, this is a device that's going to take mains power and then inside have some kind of power processing, which means you can't upgrade the power supply on this one like you can with some other DACs. But it's not a big deal, as I'll talk about shortly. Putting the DAC down for now, I just want to quickly summarize that I think the D90 is a beautiful design. Whether it's the original or the SE, they're both essentially identical aesthetically with some different labeling on the front. But I do think it's a really nice looking DAC design. I'm not necessarily a fan of the white display, but at the same time I don't dislike it, and it is a nice clean and neat system. Speaking of the display, something I did forget to mention is that the D90 will allow you to output through to the XLRs and all the RCAs. What I mean by that distinction is that you don't have to have both the RCA and the XLR running concurrently. And so on the display, when the unit's powered on, it will tell you whether it's outputting to XLR, RCA, or both. As you can no doubt tell, it's a different day that I'm recording this part of the review, and that's because I just discovered that I made a bit of an error in my first pass at the D90 SE review. Whilst it is good that it provides you the ability to select between the XLR and or the RCA output for the DAC or preamp capabilities, that functionality is hidden only within the configuration menu that's accessed via the power switch on the back. What that means is that you can't really have two different devices connected to the D90 SE and easily switch between them. So for example, if you wanted to have two sets of active speakers, you can't jump easily between one and the other. You'd have to go through the steps to get into the configuration menu, and that's just a hassle. So while this doesn't change my overall impressions of the DAC, I do think it's a real shame that Topping didn't build this in on the remote control like they did on the recently reviewed EX5. I tried pressing the line out button on the remote control just like it works on the EX5, and nothing at all happens. So I think that's a real shame, and it's a big oversight from Topping's part for something that could have been a fantastic feature to have. So I wanted to jump back in here, fix my review with this little bit of extra information. Apologies for any lack of continuity in the review as a result, but hopefully it provides a better picture for you to make your decision on the Topping D90 SE. So all in all, the D90 to me is an excellent design. Ergonomically, it's enjoyable to use. I think it's aesthetically pleasing. It's a nice compact unit. Everything about it is really, really great from a physical design perspective. And so now, of course, we need to talk about the sound. My initial impressions of the sound from the D90 are that it produces a wonderful, detailed and resolving sound, but one that's not overly bright or analytical, just detailed and resolving. The soundstage is nice and wide, but it is fairly flat, and the bass that it delivers is quite tight and punchy. It's got a really nice sense of control in the way it produces its sound. I really wish I had the original D90 here to compare between the two. But based entirely on memory, I think maybe I like the SE a little bit better than I like the original D90. As always, I like to go through when I'm testing a DAC and check out all the different inputs and outputs for any significant variations in sound quality, recognizing that the connectors and the cables can't be identical across all the different inputs and outputs. So for example, you can't match the exact same optical cable as you can a USB cable or a coaxial cable. But taking into account slight variations that may come from which protocol you're using, which sort of cable you're using, all those sorts of factors, I certainly didn't notice any significant differences between the balanced output, the RCA output, and then also between the various digital inputs that I tried, meaning coaxial, optical, and USB. As I mentioned before, I had some troubles with the I2S, which is not a reflection on the DAC. It's because I haven't used I2S a lot. Most of my gear doesn't have I2S, and so I needed a bit of fiddling to make sure that both devices are configured correctly in order to talk to each other. If you're unfamiliar with I2S, the reason for that challenge is that there's multiple versions of the connections for an I2S cable. It uses the HDMI cable, but the way it's wired is not always consistent. I suspect what was happening was I wasn't getting the right configuration for the DAC to be receiving the signal from the source, and therefore I need to tinker around a bit more. But I wanted to get this review out to you soon because it's a brand new device that many of you will be interested in looking at, and so I didn't bother messing around with I2S any further. What I will say is that based on what I've heard so far, I don't expect any significant improvement moving between USB, coaxial, optical, and then over to I2S or AES, which I also have no source devices for at the moment. And so at this point, we've got a DAC which is functionally excellent. It's compact, it looks good I think, and on its own in isolation, I think it sounds great. Feeding the burst and soloists through the balanced outputs and listening with the hi-fi and Sesvaras, it left me wanting absolutely nothing. I'm not suggesting for a second that it's as good as my normal rig with the Hugo TT2 and the M scaler, but at the level at which this sits, paired up with a comparable amp in the soloist, it was an absolutely fantastic listen. And so of course, as I like to do, I put it up against what I think are two direct competitors. One of them priced slightly below the D90 SE is the shit Bifrost 2. The other priced a little bit above the D90 SE is the Burson Audio Composer. So let's talk through what I heard, starting with the Bifrost 2. First and foremost, listening to these two required a lot of attention and focus on my part to even hear a difference. And for those that believe all DACs sound the same, there definitely was a difference. I'm very comfortable saying if I don't hear a difference, and as you'll hear me talk about shortly, in the case of the Composer, things were much less clear. But certainly with the D90 SE and the Bifrost 2, there was a difference, but the difference was pretty subtle. The Bifrost 2, to my ears, had just a slightly smoother treble to it, but it was very, very slight, and the separation was that the D90 in comparison has a very, very slight sense of glare to the treble, but it's extremely minor, and I wouldn't suggest for a second that it's a reason not to buy the D90 SE. It's just something that I was able to use as a comparison point to split the two when I was flipping back and forth. As I mentioned earlier, the D90 SE also has a really nice punchy tight bass delivery, and I found that the Bifrost 2 had a slightly warmer, fuller bass. Both are enjoyable and good quality in their own right, and I honestly don't know which is right or correct. I listened to lots of different tracks across the two to see if at any stage one presentation or the other felt like it was lacking or overdone or just slightly off balance tonally, and honestly I couldn't tell which one was better or worse. What that says is it's a very, very slight difference, and so it's not something I would base your entire decision on. But if you know that you like a slightly fuller sound, then I do think the Bifrost 2 might be better. If you like a tighter, punchier sound, then the D90 SE is probably the choice. Interestingly, I found that both presented details very, very similarly. I got no sense that either DAC was giving me more or less detail than the other, and so despite hearing on forums, in my Patreon Discord channel quite often, hearing people say that they've heard from others that the Bifrost 2 is this warmer, thicker, richer sounding DAC, I think it's maybe a little bit crazy. When I put it up right next to the D90 SE, the Bifrost 2 came across smoother in the treble and slightly fuller in the bass, but there was no sense of thickness or richness or anything like that. It's just a very slightly smoother sounding DAC. Now the reason I'm emphasizing that is that I really wanted to specify both of these are fantastic DACs. Both of these DACs sound almost identical. And so if someone's telling you that the Bifrost 2 is rich and warm, then they're basically saying the D90 SE is rich and warm, which it absolutely isn't, and neither is the Bifrost 2. So I just wanted to clarify that one because I've been hearing it a lot lately, and I always like to try to share my perspective to help balance out what else you might be hearing. That's not to say that I'm right and other people are wrong. It all depends on your perspective and where you're coming from. No doubt there are DACs on the market that are sharper and brighter, something like the RME ADI2 for example. So if that's someone's reference point, this and the Bifrost 2 might sound rich and warm. To me though, both of them sound very natural and very honest about the music coming through. And so with that little sidebar out of the way, let's talk about a specific track listening to the D90 SE and the Bifrost 2. The track that happened to come on was Talking to the Moon by Bruno Mars. On this particular track, again, the DAC sounded very, very similar. But using the soloist and the Sesvaras as I mentioned before, the Bifrost 2 was easier to listen to. That's slightly smoother, and I'm not talking about roll-off, I'm not talking about muffled or lacking in detail or veiled. What I'm talking about is the quality of the treble is smoother from the Bifrost 2, and that made it easier to listen to on this particular track. Talking to the Moon, despite being a relatively slow ballad, has quite a lot of treble information going on. There's cymbals, there's synthesizers that have got quite a lot of high frequency information going on. And from the D90 SE, things just got a little bit glary and it made it harder to separate sounds. The D90 SE was just a little bit more relaxing to listen to. Not relaxed, but relaxing. And yet all the detail is still there. Moving on to another track in my testing, $20 Nosebleed by Fall Out Boy. On that track, what I noticed was that the guitars on the left, I think they were, and then there's some percussion on the right, those were more separated from the center information and from all sounds in general on the Bifrost 2. The D90 SE, as tends to be the way for topping DACs, kind of forced everything into one wall of sound. It wasn't bad, it wasn't harsh, in fact it was very, very good, but the Bifrost 2 just did a slightly better job at separating the sounds out. If I wanted to focus just on the guitars or just on the percussion, I could actually do that much more easily on the Bifrost 2 than I could on the D90 SE. So out of the two, I still prefer the Bifrost 2. That's becoming a common theme on this channel. I love that DAC, and it's not about me having a bias towards a particular brand or anything like that. It just time and time again proves itself to be an outstanding product. Speaking of outstanding products, while I was listening to $20 Nosebleed and I'd finished with the Bifrost 2, I changed over my switch box and plugged in the Burson Audio Composer. The Burson Audio Composer retails for a little bit over $1,000, so it's a bit over $100 more than the D90 SE. Both use Sabre chips, both are fully balanced, lots of details about the two of them are very similar. Preamp capabilities, Bluetooth capabilities. The things that really separate them on paper is the D90 SE has further inputs, and the Burson Audio Composer allows you to swap op amps. My Composer is currently in its stock form, and that means it's got the V6 Vivids installed. In that configuration, comparing the two, still listening to $20 Nosebleed, what I found was that the two were basically indistinguishable. I had to concentrate really, really hard to find anything that I would say separated the two. Ultimately, what it came down to is I feel like the Composer had just slightly smoother treble at the upper end of the register. And therefore what that means is the D90 SE is a fantastic Delta Sigma DAC. So far the Composer is probably the best chip-based Delta Sigma DAC that I've heard, and therefore it puts the D90 SE right alongside it quality-wise. In terms of which one I like to interact with more, I do slightly prefer the Composer for its interface. I like the volume knob and the way interacting with that feels. I like the menu system that's available through the menu button and the on-screen display. So I'd give the slight nod to the Composer from an interaction point of view. But if you were asking me to choose one on sound quality, I don't know that I could easily do that. The reason that overall the Composer would probably get my nod is that for that little bit more than $100, you do get the ability to tweak the sound with op amps. Of course, that means investing some more money, but if you want your DAC to get a bit warmer and richer, you can swap over to the V6 Classics. Or you could try the Sparkos Labs op amps, or I've actually got some new op amps that have just arrived coming up soon. You could try those as well. Forgive me, I don't have the name on the top of my head, but watch out for the review on those if you're into op amp rolling. My point being, the Composer has more versatility. The D90 SE sounds the way it sounds and will always sound the way it sounds. Of course, the D90 SE also offers you things the Composer doesn't. You've got AES, you've got I2S, USB-B rather than USB-C if that's an issue for you, and of course the ability to decode MQA if that's important to you. So I think both DACs ultimately are excellent. For my use personally, I would choose the Composer, but only because I like the idea of rolling op amps. If I was choosing purely on sound quality and price alone, I don't necessarily see a reason to buy the Composer over and above the D90 SE. And so to bring all this to a close, I think the D90 SE is a wonderful evolution of the D90 range. As I said before, I haven't heard the original D90 for some time. I couldn't compare it directly here, but I think based on my recollection and the other things I've compared it to, I think I prefer the SE to the original D90. So if you're in the market for a fantastic DAC that has all sorts of versatility, all sorts of inputs, can do every possible format I think you could throw at it with the high-res PCM, the high-res DSD, all those sorts of things, then the D90 SE should absolutely be on your list. I didn't mention before, which was an error on my part, but I want to thank Apos Audio for sending the D90 SE for me to review. If you're in North America and you're thinking about buying one of these, I'll put a link down below where you can click through to Apos and say thank you for making this review possible. Apos Audio are an affiliate of the channel, so I will receive some income from any sales through Apos, but as you've probably gathered by now, that hasn't influenced my opinions of the D90 SE. I don't think it's the best DAC in the world, but I do think it's a really solid performer at its price point, and I would recommend it to anyone that wants this feature set and good quality sound. For those of you outside North America, of course, I'll check out some other links and see what I can find and pop those down below to make it easy for you to buy the D90 SE if it takes your fancy as well. For now though, let me remind you about the Palmu Quiet Mini giveaway. Don't forget to subscribe and comment with something you want to know more about in the audiophile hobby. And for now, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.